Some of the things we discussed at a very early stage is that we would like to try and build a company that does it right from the beginning, that relies on a business model that would also be relevant in 100 years.
Hello and welcome to In Between Charges. My name is Kevin Spangenberg, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Mike Hawkes. Mike, how are things going on that side of the Atlantic?
I would say things are going okay, mixed, maybe a little bit calmer than where you are right now. We're just recording this at the time when the presidential election has just been announced. So at least here, we have 2035 combustion engine bans still holding semi-strong. The European Commission is kind of pushing for it. But in some countries, charge point rollout has already started to outpace the adoption of sales of EVs. So, in that case, still pretty good.
Sounds a little more stable over there. We're recording this 2 days after the election, so things have been rattled over here, I would say, especially in our industry. So everyone's kind of holding their breath right now and wondering what the hell this means for green technology, sustainable technology. The EV sector specifically is kind of wondering what the new regime is going to bring to town. But I think that's probably for another time. We'll probably discuss that at some point. But today we are continuing our focus on the charge point operators of the world, looking to gain insights and share a deeper understanding of these sometimes nascent businesses that are delivering charging solutions to drivers across Europe and North America. And I have been looking very much forward to today's conversation because it is with a leader from a company that most Copenhageners know quite well. However, they might not necessarily immediately associate the name of the company with charging. And that company is called Viggo, but with a crucially important and distinct new brand that we will discuss in just a few seconds. For people in Copenhagen, Viggo is a name that springs to mind when you think of ride-hailing apps. And rightfully so, they provide an excellent service in our beautiful city with their electric cars zipping around, carrying riders to and fro. So why are we having someone from this company on to discuss EV charging? Well, they are making waves in the charging industry with their unique approach, and that's what we're excited to discuss today. So I want to welcome Mads Vind, the managing director at Viggo, but I think you might correct me about the name of the company you are working for, Mads. So welcome to In Between Charges, and please, if you could describe the company you work for a little bit and why this has recently changed.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. It's true what you say. We recently changed the name in the energy business from Viggo Energy to Stella. And the reason why we did that is primarily because we had some customers, primarily private EV owners, who were reluctant to visit our chargers simply because they thought it was only for taxis. And so that was one of the reasons why we decided to change the name. And so far it's been received quite well, both across existing users, but also new customers as well. So I very much look forward to sort of continuing building out this Stella brand, even though we are, located in the same location, have the same location so far.
Let's get straight into it and talk the Stella business model. And maybe you can describe the journey of the artist formerly known as Viggo Energy. Maybe talk about your kind of unique journey as I believe you started maybe as a ride sharing app and then also started to do charging as well. So talk about the journey of Viggo Energy / Stella and kind of what informed your current business model and why you believe there's a big opportunity in this charging space.
Yeah, sure. So Viggo was founded back in 2019, and that's also when I joined the company. Back then I was the CFO, and we were primarily sort of a new taxi company in town, or mobility provider, to use a more fancy expression. We sort of born out of the ashes of Uber, who decided to leave the Danish market at one point. So we thought, okay, we want to take the best from the Uber approach, where you get a very stellar app experience and a customer journey. But then we still have to have all the legacy from the traditional taxi industry as well. And then we just wanted it to start out as a 100% EV-driven setup, right? And in the beginning, there was a lot of the competitors in the market who was literally laughing. They thought it was completely ludicrous to run a 100% EV business from the beginning. We kind of stuck to it and thought, okay, this is the future. Like, we are going to do it right from the beginning. And then we probably had been operating for a little less than half a year. And then COVID hit. So we were, to put it mildly, knocked back to the start. I think we lost 95% of revenue overnight. So that was some pretty hard months for us because we just started and we didn't have a big war chest to sort of lean against where we got through it. And then we could actually see that as we sort of added more vehicles, EVs, to the platform there, we had a bit of a bottleneck in terms of getting electricity onto these vehicles. So we had incidents where it could be a Lidl shop out in Amager who had set up a slow charger. You could be certain that there was always a Viggo charging there. Super frustrating for the regular customers. So pretty much all slow charging around the city was in some way, shape, or form occupied by some of our drivers. And not only does it take a long time, you guys know all about that, but it's also not very friendly to other EV owners who just can't get access to chargers, right? And then at the same time, it was just not very profitable for a taxi driver to be stuck in a slow charger for a long time. So we had kind of a pain. So basically the energy business that we are to talk about today all started out with a bit of a pain and a bottleneck for us, right? And so naturally, because I was the CFO, I had to sort of do the numbers and figure out, okay, how do we solve this issue? And we thought about either going to an existing CPO, but we didn't really think that anyone had sort of cracked this code yet. Nobody really sort of catered to our customers, which was eventually the taxi drivers, right? So the spreadsheet said that we should try to do it on our own. And so we opened up a location out in Ballerup, which is called Laudoparken. It's referred to as the Danish Silicon Valley. I'm not sure that is really true, but at least that's what we tell ourselves. So that's where we started. And this particular location performed much better than it was anticipated in the spreadsheet. And that thought got us on the hook, so to speak, right? And then luckily for us, we managed to get a very central location in Bernstorffsgade, which is one of those sort of veins coming into Copenhagen. And we built out in the beginning, I think it was 8 charge points, and now it's 14 of the ultra-fast chargers. And that has been performing really well ever since. It's really become sort of it's not a taxi hub per se, because it's open for all and will be forever. But the idea is that it underlines the USPs that we typically sort of attribute to the locations that we build out. It has to be super urban, so the more central, the better. It has to be of a certain size so that you don't have to wait in line. We would like not to impose sort of like queuing systems or anything like that. We would just like to build more chargers, basically. And then it's always also fast charging, so we never go below 300. There's also exceptions, but in general, we would like to build also fast chargers so that you know as a customer, if you go to one of our locations, it's always super fast. And then, of course, we have dreams of becoming 100% renewables. So far, we have historically been doing that through certificates. I guess it's better than just regular market energy, but it can be done better. So we have started also to look into the PPAs and have our first PPA come online here in December in Mesballe in Jutland, which will support our sites in Jutland. So long story short, after we sort of opened up in Bernstorffsgade there, we could see that, okay, this really works. Now all the taxi drivers can get electricity fairly fast, take around half an hour, and they're good to go, right? Most of them probably charge on average at least one time a day, and maybe even more in the weekends when they work a lot. And then from there, we got more and more focus on the energy side of things. We had a couple of years where there was not that many alternatives in the city. So naturally, we had a very strong business model back then, basically just always selling energy on the go. We have never done the subscription model. Who knows if we'll do it in the future, but so far it works really well for us to pay as you go. And naturally, the professional drivers and so on, especially our own drivers, they get it at a better price because they charge a lot, right? So if you consume a lot of energy, you can get a better price.
Yeah, I think it's a really great business model that you've been able to form here. And I like talking about it from the pain point of your drivers, but then also customers and other retailers who are trying to attract individuals into their shops, for example, with Lidl. But then just so I also understand and we can kind of communicate it to the audience a little bit how Viggo works. So Viggo, you you have the fleet of vehicles, right? And then you have individual small business owners that will effectively lease them under their own name and their own company name. And then they will operate their taxi services and basically generate revenue.
Yeah, so Viggo is the platform, so to speak, and the drivers are independent and they go out and lease their own vehicles. We basically just provide the platform and then we take a cut of the revenue. It's a very transparent model. It's 7.5% of all the revenue that's generated in the cars. And that is how Viggo Mobility makes money.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Did you say 7.5%? Sorry?
Yeah.
Compare that to other platforms, that's incredible. What's Uber, 30% or more?
It's like more than that, I feel like. When I talk to Uber drivers, they're like, oh, they're taking 40, 50%. It's ridiculous. You're treating the drivers well.
Some of the things we discussed at a very early stage is that we would like to try and build a company that does it right from the beginning, that relies on a business model that would also be relevant in 100 years. So we wanted to find a balance where we know that our drivers can actually pay their bills.
And then, so carrying on then to the charging business for Stella Energy. So you already have basically a captive market. Your drivers stay within the charging network. It's a trusted brand. It's ultra fast. And you're also putting charge points in locations where they might be sitting waiting for a fare. So Copenhagen Airport, for example, is a big place. One kind of maybe question back is, as you're now spinning off Stella Energy as a bit of an open and a broader brand, what you're also trying to do is attract a broader audience, I would assume. So not just your drivers that are Viggo drivers, but also anybody else, a private individual, but also kind of other kind of commercial fleets, etc. What is it that made you drive that decision? Because it could also mean your taxi drivers have longer waiting queues, for example, or there's also negotiations on price and prioritization of the actual charge point. So what made you actually make that step and that choice away from a pretty strong and captive target audience?
So I think it's important to, state the fact that the Viggo Mobility business has been a great stepping stone for us in terms of actually building out the chargers. It's quite expensive to build out ultra-fast chargers.
Yeah.
So naturally, if you don't have a lot of demand on these chargers, well, you're going to run out of money pretty fast. So we have spent a great deal of time actually trying to figure out where should we locate the chargers. We spend a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out where we should place them to make sure that they have high utilization, right? So we kind of see, where do they drive? Where do they have trips? Where would it make sense for us to actually build out this network to support them? But as you say, we also need to sort of expand the customer base. And this is also one of the reasons why we decided to rename into Stella. To say it as it is, it's much easier to sell electricity to some of your competitors if you don't have the same name. They all recognize that we have very good locations in Greater Copenhagen, and naturally they would like to access these, which they are more than welcome to do. We have always had the principle that we wanted to build for professional, but we wanted to remain open for all. So if you're a private EV owner, you can go and charge. If you're professional, you can go and charge as well. As I said before, if you have the higher demand you have for electricity, the better the price you can get, right? It's fairly simple in that regard. And now that we are opening up, we are trying to ask ourselves, okay, who has the biggest issue when it comes to charging, but also who has the most sort of need for actually infrastructure to make that happen, right? So when we started out in Copenhagen, you didn't really have proper infrastructure to actually run an electric taxi, right? It was just not possible, right? I think we have managed to prove now that if you have that in a city like Copenhagen, then the taxis, which is probably the segment that drives the most, on a daily basis, if you have that sort of infrastructure, they will make the switch.
From petroleum to...
Yes, to EVs, right? And a good example is probably in Oslo now, as we've seen the new regulation come into force here 1st of November, where they are basically forcing the taxi drivers to drive on EVs if they want to make money in Oslo. And for them, it's a bit of a hassle now because they didn't really focus on the infrastructure first. So a lot of these taxi companies are slightly desperate to actually get proper, fast energy onto their vehicles so they can go and make money. And it's come to a point where some of the local taxi companies have actually sued the Oslo municipality to sort of stop this new regulation to come into force because they say, well, it's great that we have to switch to EVs, but where do you want us to charge? This is one of the reasons why we are now moving into Oslo, actually, and building out 4 ultra-fast charging locations in the center of Oslo to try and sort of solve this issue of infrastructure for professional drivers, really, which is our focus, right? So our main customers, also in the sense that now we are opening up the scope, is primarily the taxi drivers because they drive the most. They have the biggest issue in terms of getting electricity onto their vehicles fast enough and most sort of central for where they work. But then at the same time, we know that just after the taxi drivers has done the switch, there will be a big group of other professional drivers like logistics or last mile delivery companies and so on, who is most likely going to do the switch as well. They have different sort of use cases, but in the end of the day, they also need proper infrastructure to make this happen, or they will simply not make the switch.
Yes, tons of topics there. And I think maybe we can talk a little bit about network expansion next, because I think your approach to Oslo is fantastic.
The lack of infrastructure there, that kind of shocks me, right? I've not spent a lot of time in Oslo, not like Mike. Mike's up there, once a month or so. But
yeah, every time I'm there, where are the charge points? I'm shocked.
Right. Norway is always held up as the model country, right? And I would have assumed, wow, okay, I'm sure the taxi fleet up there is electric. And you said, well, maybe this regulation just came into force a week ago, right? And then you'll say there's actually a shortage of this type of urban fast charging that Stella is bringing to the market. I would have just assumed automatically, of course, there's an abundance of fast charging options throughout Oslo, but you're saying that's not the case.
So there's plenty of slow chargers in Oslo. A lot. But there's not really anyone who's catering to this market. And this is what is a bit strange to us, that the municipality, they're basically imposing this rule that you have to drive an EV car from 1st of November if you want to run it as a taxi company. Then I think they realized, okay, well, if this is going to happen, we need to build some proper professional infrastructure for the taxis to come and charge, right? And so they made a tender for 5 locations, and we were fortunate enough to win 4 of them. And in the beginning, I had the same approach, right? I was like, does it even make sense for us to try and venture into Oslo? But then we did the analysis of Oslo and the charge points available and try to understand how the city really works. And we could pretty pretty early on see that there was a huge need for proper UFCs, as central as you can get, because there's almost 4,000 taxis in Oslo, right?
Yeah.
It's many more than you have in Copenhagen. And we are building out 26 ultra-fast charge points. 26 ultra-fast charge points plus the 604-ish. So let's say it's in total 32 ultra-fast charge points that's now being built out for these professionals to come and charge. And there's almost 4,000 taxis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be...
it's going to be really, really tough. Because I was thinking before this conversation as well, and I checked on different charging maps, also checked on our app as well, because I was thinking, okay, you're going straight into the country that has almost 100% EV sales already. Next year, combustion engine vehicles are completely banned. And I was like, surely you're going to be facing some competition here. So then you have to differentiate with price or with, performance, but also trying to then become a well-known brand. But everywhere within the Oslo commune, as you say, is slow charging. There's probably a few Tesla chargers. And maybe it's also a gap from different countries and also municipalities. The fast charging has been focused on highway networks to be able to connect different cities. But then within the city, people are looking at, okay, more people live in condominiums, so they can slow charge there, or they can maybe slow charge in their supermarket or whatever.
We have done sort of the same analysis in Stockholm. It's exactly the same. There's no ultra-fast charging. It's the same in Hamburg. It's the same in Berlin. It's the same in London.
Yeah.
All these sort of major cities who has thousands of taxis that within a fairly reasonable amount of years will have to switch regardless. Either it's being forced by some regulation, or it will be sort of public opinion that will drive that change, and they have nowhere to charge, right?
So when you are now, as you plan the Oslo expansion, the Stockholm expansion and everything, right, you're going up there. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Viggo, the ride-hailing app, is not available in Stockholm and Oslo. Is that correct?
The mobility business?
Yeah, the mobility. So when you go up there, it's kind of a different expansion model, right, where you don't have the built-in drivers. So kind of talk us through a little bit how you are going to get the Stella brand out there, right? And make sure that you're front of mind when the 4,000 plus taxis as they electrify need to charge. Is it okay, we're going to be in a prime location. There's no way they can avoid us. Is there going to be more that goes into your expansion effort?
Yeah, sure. So I think in the old days, the go-to-market strategy was basically, build it and they will come, right? We do not really have that luxury anymore. So we spend quite a deal of time actually going to this market and talk to the local players, trying to understand what is actually their needs. Is there certain areas of the city where they, see a bigger need for charge points to be built? If that's the case, we go into a dialogue where we say, okay, well, if we were to build here, how much were you going to use it? Or will you commit to some sort of usage in this area of the city? And then we basically try to make agreements so we can sort of hit the ground running. So by the time the locations are actually ready to go, I think the first one in Oslo will open up in December, and the last one will open up in February. Then we already know who are our customers, so to speak, right? We already have the relations, we agreed on pricing, everything is more or less sort of set up before we set up shop.
Okay. And when you say then professional customers, we were talking about this also briefly off mic and off camera about how basically Viggo's competitors in other markets haven't taken the approach to be able to build out a charging network. And so as a result, you have now a very interesting value proposition for them. So you can compete in a new market without having to directly compete with your ride kind of sharing business, right? So your kind of target audience is other ride sharing businesses, other fleet providers. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're trying to stay really niche. You could argue that there's probably more EVs in other segments, if that makes sense. But we are really sort of laser focused on this particular segment, which is professional drivers. In the first instant, it will be the taxi drivers because we can see that they have the biggest needs. And they have the sort of, at least in some cities around Europe, the biggest sort of burning platform, if that makes sense, right? And I think, as you pointed out, some of the other CPOs in the market have had a very big focus on slow chargers and private EV owners and maybe destination chargers and highway chargers and so on. And I think it makes no sense for us to compete for the same customers when there's basically a segment here which is not catered to in a sufficient way, if that makes sense.
So then maybe to talk about the segments a little bit and the inspiration behind the rebrand. You're going for the taxi fleets, these fleets and largely like taxi companies. But did you find that maybe you did a survey or maybe it was just to kind of discussing with EV drivers around Copenhagen that people were a little bit confused and they're like, I didn't know I could charge at those Viggo Energy sites? Was that one of the drivers behind the rebrand?
Yeah, I was definitely one of the drivers. We know from surveys and just general word of mouth that some private EV owners were reluctant to go to the Viggo chargers because they thought it was taxi hubs. It's never been the case. It's always been open to all. So this is a way for us to make that distinction and make sure that everybody knows that this is a place you can come and charge.
Maybe then one other kind of question on or maybe just a comment on the network expansion piece, because I think you talk about taxi companies, you're being laser focused on them. And yes, maybe that's not the majority of drivers who are out there are taxi drivers. But I think also there's this kind of perception, and we've talked a little bit about it on some previous episodes, about who is actually driving or owning the majority of EVs out there. And it's not private owners, by and large. particularly now in the last 10 years, people tend to lease vehicles from companies. And then also a lot of them are fleets, ride sharing, etc. And then also last mile delivery type companies and all transportation. And so I think it's interesting. Yes, you say you're really laser focused on taxi drivers, but also have a very strong proposition to companies or businesses or last mile delivery type groups as well, where there is a vested interest in them trying to set up a framework agreement with a company like Stella Energy to, I don't know, get a guarantee on price, get a guarantee on performance, get a guarantee on reliability of the charge points.
Yeah, that is true as well. We talked to some of these larger fleet owners. A lot of these companies, they have sort of like they started or maybe, dipped their toes into the whole EV transition. They know they have to do it. It's a mandate from the board typically that they have to do it. And they not always have a very good sort of understanding of where to start, right? Like, so some of their drivers there, they would have a need when they drive around the countryside or the city to top up or do sort of like, smaller charge sessions throughout the day to make it happen. They most likely also have employees who have been granted some sort of company car, which is an EV. They most likely also have a need for a home charger. How do they cover that? And in the end of the day, they would like to go to sort of one provider who can cater to all these needs, because if they have to make, a number of agreements with a lot of different sort of network providers and CPOs, and it's quite clear already now, and it wasn't clear like a year ago, that now this sort of like EV transition on a larger scale for professional companies that have bigger fleets is starting to happen, right?
That's also kind of our, point of view and part of our strategy here at Monto. It's as soon as you start with one case where people want to charge and the type of customers that might also want to charge at your locations very quickly starts to connect. It is like a network architecture of what you want to offer and the charge points that you put out there. Everything is connected. I'm very interested to follow Stella's journey and how you navigate that, what your kind of next step is basically outside from taxi sharing.
Can you give an example of those types of companies? Over here in the US, we see, people say fleet. They're like, fleet's big. I hear that word every other day. And I'm like, well, okay, what fleets are we talking about here tangibly? What other types of companies are we talking about here a little bit, and how you're getting to them, what types of agreements you're setting up with them, and who's kind of driving that electrification in the fleet space in Denmark anyway?
Yeah, so I can't really mention any names because they're all still under negotiation. But you can imagine if you have could be a logistics company or a postage company, delivery company, stuff like that, right? They already have the fleets, right? They kind of have a pretty good understanding of, how many vehicles do they have and will have that is purely EV. And they also know their driving patterns quite well. They have started to hand out EVs to the employees as company cars and all that, but they don't really know how to connect all the dots, right? They don't really know how to structure it. They would, to my understanding, at least prefer one provider, right? So they would like to have a partner that can sort of solve all these charging needs, if that makes sense, right? And provide some sort of platform where this can actually be done in a transparent way. For a lot of the companies, we see also that they are naturally, they want a good price on the electricity, but the rest of the stuff is much more important, right? That they have good transparency, they have good reporting, the usage and the spending and all this stuff to a degree that's very detailed, actually, which is, of course, not very important if you have one vehicle or if you're just a private EV owner, right? So they have very different needs compared to private EV owners. So they're not very focused on price. Naturally, you want a good price. Everyone wants that, but they're more focused on the convenience, the stability, and so on, and the locations, of course, than the price. That's what we experienced so far.
Yeah. Building off that, and this is something I'm kind of fascinated by when it comes to CPOs, is everybody has a little bit of different mix that they're putting together, right? And you talked about putting all those elements together, the roaming, the service, the availability, the reliability for the fleet customers, for anybody who's coming up and charging on Stella. Can you talk about the discussions you have when it comes to knitting together your partnership ecosystem? Because I think people listen to this podcast, they'll know Monta and Stella are close partners. So maybe just talk about how you think through putting together these partnerships, what Stella can do, what Viggo can do, and then when you decide, all right, we need a partner for this piece, we need a partner for this piece, and to really complete and complement the offering you're putting together for the taxi fleets.
Yeah, sure. So for our journey, if that makes sense, we started out as not knowing much and basically just asked someone to build out a location for us, and they handed over the keys by the time I was done. Now we have more sort of in-house capabilities, have a much stronger understanding of what parts in this puzzle you actually need to make it happen. We are still not insourcing those capabilities to actually build out the network. We still believe that should be, third party who takes care of that from a, installation perspective. But we do quite a lot of work on the projecting of things to make sure that these pieces come together and things are built out in a way that we think makes sense. These are professional drivers, so it has to work, right? It doesn't have to be a pain for them to go and charge.
Can you give maybe a couple examples of that? Because I guess there you're talking about design of the car park, what types of services are there, and I guess how wide the spaces are. Super kind of practical things that go over and above managing the individual charge points?
So I think if we were building out slow chargers, it's just parking lots. It doesn't matter much. Somebody will park and somebody will charge. When we build out all the fast charging stations, we actually say no to quite a lot of locations because we simply cannot get the math to pan out, if that makes sense. Like, as you say, if the vehicles cannot get in and out fast enough, or if they will literally drive into each other trying to get in and out of the charging base, then it's going to be a mess. So we spend a great deal on that, actually, to design locations that from a usage perspective is quite nice, or quite to a standard that meets these professional drivers' demands, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's like the other concept of being a network operator, an ultra-fast network operator, is feng shui. You have to get the whole dynamics and the setup of the location right.
Yeah. And so from a more sort of technical perspective, naturally we run on the Monza backend. And this is a switch we have done in our journey as well, that we needed to find a provider who could actually sort of solve those specific needs that you have when you're running also fast charging. Because it's a lot of charge sessions. People expect it to work. You need to see very high sort of success rates when it comes to actually starting a charge and successfully getting through that charge. So we have been on the lookout for a strong partner who actually had a much more sort of digital or technical expertise and focus, much more than just a focus on running software that is more tailored towards sort of slow charging. But for us, we don't have a lot of charge points, but what we have is super high utilization, which means that we need to make sure that the lights on these Christmas trees are always on, right? So that the people that come and visit these sites, they have a certainty that it always works. That is actually the most important thing for us, to make sure that the reliability of these chargers is as close to 100% as possible, if that makes sense. Yeah.
When it comes to our ultra-fast charging partners, right, and Stella is one of our premier ones, and Mike and I have taken a look at the internal utilization numbers, and it's high, right? They're used a lot. The amount of kilowatts that are charged on there is high, and it's always kind of fun to take a look at that. And I pull it up, I don't know, once every couple of weeks, I'll take a look, and about half of them are being used at any point in the day, right? And it's pretty cool to see. The numbers on them are crazy, and the importance of them working and everything is just like, it's second to none. Like you said, if a couple of level 2 slow chargers are down during the day, we don't like that, we don't want that and everything, but that's not make or break for a business. But like when things don't work for you for an hour or something, like that is a significant loss in revenue during that time frame. So you really have to make sure that these are working, the charge is executing all the time. And that's exactly. Hugely important.
Yeah. Remember, Kevin, we did the math on this, I think, a while ago, and I don't have the exact number now, but I think something like an hour of downtime is 300 to 600 euros, just like that. And if that's only one charging site or set, imagine what that is like across a whole portfolio of the organization. You know, that is a big loss that's on the table.
It is. And it's not only the loss from the revenue perspective. The way professional customers perceive the network is that it's super reliable. So if it's suddenly not reliable anymore, they will maybe go somewhere else to charge, right? Like you don't have to have that many sort of like misses where you actually cannot charge for some reason before you start to look elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Loyalty in this market for your customers, particularly as you're opening up to new customers and new markets where that reliability has to be established from day one. Yeah. It's fickle. You have to try to keep network drivers within that.
Yeah, sure. That's very true.
Yeah.
Do you find that the taxi drivers are very price sensitive, or maybe less so, and they just need it to work and everything? They'll take a higher price, or they'll prioritize the location and the ease of use and everything, and maybe they'll pay an extra kroner or something?
I think it's both a yes and no kind of answer here. Like taxi drivers are quite price sensitive. They also have a margin business. It's no secret that you probably will not get rich and famous from driving a taxi there. So they work hard to make a living. And so a few, cents here and there on the kilowatt hour price makes a big difference. We try to cater that with a bit of a mix when it comes to pricing the kilowatt hours throughout the day. So there's hours where it's significantly cheaper than the peak hours. We do that both to sort of spread out the demand of the chargers, but then at the same time also giving these taxi drivers an option to save some money, if that makes sense. But then on the contrary, if you don't have the other stuff as well, meaning the location and the size and the speed, well, then it's not good enough either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you have a great location, but it's too slow, or if you have a poor location, it's fast, but it's too expensive, right? Or something, you kind of have to really piece all of those together, right?
Exactly, right? There's a lot of handles you can sort of turn. And I think getting that balance right is what we excel at, to be honest. That is what we have done since we started. And I think we have a very good understanding of what you need as a professional driver for it to work, to find that balance, if that makes sense.
But then how about finding the balance for Stella Energy? Because as we kind of know, margins in the operator business are already very tight. And whilst you talk about the actual costs of energy and the network fees, the bigger costs really are getting over this CapEx investment to be able to purchase the charge point, install the charge point, get the wiring down, and then also hire the contractors as well to be able to do it. So companies are looking at quite a long return on that investment. and also a growing one as you continue to expand the network. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you manage that balance internally at Stella Energy?
So it becomes a bit of a tricky answer, this one. So in the old days here in Copenhagen, there was a less sort of focus on price because there was not an alternative. In Denmark now we see prices being driven down quite a lot, which means smaller margins, as you say, and longer payback times. That's how it is. It's a market condition. The funny thing to me has been to go to Oslo, where there's a sort of an acceptance that if you go and purchase ultra-fast charging in a city center, it costs more money. Right? That seems to be sort of a fair assessment from a potential charging customer in Oslo that if you want that sort of extra speed or the convenience or whatever, then it costs a bit more money, right?
Yeah.
And they seem to accept that. It might be because that their charging market is more mature. They've done this for many years, whereas in a Danish context, there seems to be such a crazy focus on just getting the price of the kilowatt hours down. For some private EV owners, they do not seem to understand the difference between kilowatt hour coming out of a slow charger and then the one coming out of ultra fast charger, right? They would say, well, it's the same product, right? And it is. But I would say that I spend much more money providing this infrastructure and put down more capex to make it happen.
Yeah.
And I would like a premium for that. But that does not seem to be the case yet in Denmark, right? We are in a strange sort of period or territory where it just has to be as cheap as possible, right? And we will see some customers literally driving that extra 10 minutes to save in total 4 kroner. And it makes no sense, right?
Why would you think it's a question of maturity of the market? I would think a more mature market like Oslo, where the prices would be driven down then, whereas here, where if it's still coming up a little bit, people maybe still not be sophisticated shoppers or buyers, I guess, for lack of a better term. So why do you think it's a question of the maturity of the market in Denmark and Copenhagen? It's just been driven down, down, down.
That is a super good question, and you might be right that it's the other way around. I think Oslo has found some sort of balance where the CPOs actually providing this kind of infrastructure requires some sort of level of profitability to make it work. Whereas here in Denmark, the CPOs still are trying to figure out what's the right price, right? And we have players in the market who sort of like competing primarily on price to win customers. When this market share race is done, eventually, I think prices will even out, if that makes sense. In the end of the day, it all comes down to how much electricity do I need to sell at a certain price with a certain margin in order to make payback times digestible for whoever is going to finance it. And that's why I'm saying there's a maturity in the Norwegian market, at least to my knowledge, that they have sort of found a balance where this sort of evens out.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And maybe this is also a topic that we can continue as well, because I also don't know what it is. What is the difference between one country and the next where you have a completely different willingness to pay? Fair enough, Norway is is the most mature market in Europe when it comes to EV adoption. Mm-hmm. But Denmark's doing pretty well as well. You know, we're kind of up to 70% or so in kind of EV sales, or maybe it's 50% and 70% kind of forecast next year. And I was looking at some of the price variations. I can share this report that you've read by GridX. Mm-hmm. And Denmark and Norway have pretty slim ranges in the kind of average price that it takes to recharge an actual individual vehicle. And that suggests, mature market, much more competition on price. Everything is kind of squeezed compared to some of the other countries. Croatia, for example, charging your car could range from under 10 euros for your 30 kilowatt hour charge or over 100 euros. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of huge. Whereas in Denmark, that would be basically 5 to 12 euros. And in Norway, it's the same. But the ad hoc price for charging in Norway shoots way off what happens in Denmark. And over there, it's kind of 21 to 22 euros that people are willing to pay. That, to me, suggests a consumer demand, particularly for ad hoc charging. It's not someone who's even a direct customer of yours. It's someone who's just turning up to a charge, needs something, and then off they go, and they're willing to pay a premium for that.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Mess, over here in the U.S., one of the big topics of discussion is, as the U.S. is quite a bit behind when it comes to this type of charging, and the public charging infrastructure is really lagging behind in terms of performance and options and everything. But some of the newer players here that are trying to build out this DC fast charging network over here, they're really focused on the services they're providing at the charger, right? And they're like, okay, we need to put a nice convenience store there. We need to have some nice restrooms, have a nice canopy. Have you guys thought about the service, the environment around the charging and everything? Or you're like, these are taxi drivers that just come 20 minutes and then they're on their way and we don't need to sell them a Snickers bar? Or how do you think about that?
We have never really had that much focus on all that sort of extra stuff. We haven't had that because we have been very focused on actually just getting the chargers to market. We know that it's, at least to some extent, it's probably a double or triple the capex you will need to put in order for all that extra stuff, whether it's, canopies or toilets or kiosk or whatever it is. So the cost of setting up chargers will be significantly higher. And we didn't really have that luxury, to be honest, to sort of build that out. I think eventually down the line, we will probably do more of it, especially on the larger locations where there's a lot of charge points. Then it's definitely a nice thing to have that you can, go to a restroom or you get a cup of coffee or whatever you need. I think down the line, we will keep doing these sort of I wouldn't call them simple as such because there is lights and, trash cans and stuff, but we much rather focus on building out the network that's needed to support the professional customers there than having all that extra niceness that you could have as well. I mean, it's no secret that we do not have a big sort of a rich older brother who could sort of finance these kind of luxury, if that makes sense, right? So we still have to be smart about our CapEx spend and make sure that we build out locations where we know it makes sense and then build out some more instead of trying to sort of bring it from an 8 to a 10 location, if that makes sense.
Do you find from what you talked about surveys and customer, discussions and everything, do you hear from these drivers like, oh man, I wish I could buy a cup of coffee here? Or do you see they just want to make sure they can pull in, there's a charger available, it works, I'm in and out of there in 20 minutes, and that's priority number one, and all those other things are a little bit lower down the hierarchy of needs?
I think if I asked them if you wanted more chargers or, coffee shop, then they would say more chargers, right? But again, they are just humans, so naturally they would also like to, get a cup of coffee or visit the restroom. So what we typically do is we make agreements with the surrounding shops and maybe a hotel where people can go get a coffee or borrow the bathroom and so on. And that has worked so far pretty well, I would say. Yeah.
Or get a burger, right? A gasoline grill.
Exactly,
a gasoline grill. That's a pretty good spot.
They would have to change their name though, wouldn't they? It wouldn't be gasoline grill. It would be electricity grill.
Electricity.
They have a pretty strong brand with gasoline grill.
Exactly,
I think it might be tough, but
it would be hard to change.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's maybe then change back to a topic that you started talking a little bit about earlier, about power purchase agreements, wholesale agreements. One of the kind of theories that we have, Kevin, we've been talking a little bit about this and also kind of internally is when will we start to see the shift from getting charge points and infrastructure in the ground through to consumers making a conscious choice to charge at a place where you can guarantee a higher proportion or even 100% renewable energy versus not. And in general, we're simply not there yet. The infrastructure isn't there. I think also the mechanism in general to be able to guarantee that is also, it's getting there, right? But as you started to allude to earlier, you can purchase all of your energy from a renewable energy company, but you can't necessarily guarantee that the energy consumed and the electrons traded at that time is actually coming from that kind of source. So how important do you see that being to your drivers today? And when do you start to see that shift, if it's not already important to your drivers coming into the future?
It's been quite an interesting journey as well, actually. We started out having 100% electric vehicles in the mobility business in Viggo. And in the beginning there, it was just a taxi, right? It didn't matter much to the, B2B customers who were actually ordering quite a lot of trips with us. But then eventually it became an important fact that there was an electric car. And that is also when some of the other taxi companies in Copenhagen started to make their switch into EVs. And now there was also infrastructure to actually make it happen. And then from there it became, the next question of, okay, but what kind of energy actually goes into these vehicles? So we have seen now a bigger sort of, it's almost a demand. We need to make sure that whatever these vehicles are actually driving on, so to speak, has to be renewable in some shape or form. Whether it's through certificates or whether it's through the PPAs, that is not yet as important, but I assume it will come, right? But we definitely see a switch in the market from the end customer side of things, who has some sort of a need to know what kind of electricity that actually charge this car. And I think that's actually kind of nice.
Yeah.
I think it will grow a lot over the coming years. And it's also down to the CPOs to actually be able to communicate this. We are not able to do that yet, but it will be kind of a cool feature if you can actually say, well, this trip is mostly driven on X percentage of renewables that most likely came from this solar cell somewhere, right? I mean, if we get to that point, I think the transparency and the communication around why it's important will be much stronger. And I think it's a really strong selling point, actually.
I'm a regular Viggo user. What I quite like is being able to see the CO2 emissions as a result of driving electric as opposed to driving fossil fuels, petroleum or kind of diesel. And I assume that calculation is made based on a trade-off of emissions from fossil fuels as opposed to electric cars. Yeah. And I agree. I would also love to be able to see, and it's something that we're also building very much and kind of focused in our platform for fleets, is to be able to report and say, this is actually how many green electrons have been traded, because eventually companies will probably have to start reporting on this. Maybe there's a point where Viggo will need to start reporting on this, and that's something that's mandated.
We would like to drive that change. I think that's a super cool proposal, to be honest. We purchase our energy from a Danish company called Reel, and they're doing these fractional PPAs as well, which we are signing up to now. And they can actually tell us that over the last, I think, plus 12 months or some, our renewable share is more than 75%. So we can actually guarantee that it's been somewhat renewable, whatever has been put into the vehicles that charged on our network. And naturally, we would like that to grow, right? To become more. And I think that will come as soon as these PPA starts to come live.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, Mez, over here in America, I was at an EV trade show a few months back, and I was hoping that there was going to be a lot of CPOs there. Unfortunately, there were not. There were primarily hardware companies, right? Everybody with their big DC fast chargers, and everybody was touting their battery-assisted charger, basically. Over here in America, these demand charges really affect CPO's profitability in a month. And so what they'll do is they trickle charge a battery throughout the day. Maybe there's 10 cars that show up at the same time. Then they draw from the battery as opposed to drawing from the grid, and they avoid costly charges. So I think I've heard you guys have experimented with a couple different battery approaches. Maybe you could touch on that and your thoughts about battery-assisted charging and how you interact with the grid in that regard.
Yeah, sure. We have actually just recently installed our first battery-integrated charger in a location called Landgreven. It's the one right next to this gasoline grill. So it's a very popular site, and it has a lot of traffic throughout the day. We had some limitations to this location. We didn't have that many sort of amps available in the grid, which means that we couldn't really provide that 300 kilowatts that we tell our customers that we prefer. So we had a bit of a limitation there, and we couldn't get any more. It was not possible to build out the grid. So we started to look into batteries, and we found a German provider of a integrated charger. So basically, we are able to take fairly little amps from the grid and then still bring it up to 300 kilowatts. That is super nice for our professional customers and also regular EV owners to come and charge at a faster speed. And it's the only ultra-fast charger in the center of Copenhagen. Not only is it really cool that we can now do 300 kilowatts in the city center, but it also gives us other sort of a means to make better business or a better profit. We can do the peak share, where we basically fill up the battery when the energy is cheap, and then we can tap it when it is expensive. And then we can do balancing services towards the grid as well to make that additional revenue on balancing services. This is something that we are quite eager to get started on. The charger yet has not really been approved yet for this kind of work in Denmark, but it's prepared to do it. And then on top of that, there's two 70 inches screens on each side of this charger, which also gives us the opportunity to run commercials, outdoor commercials there, and then make some sort of additional revenue on sort of movie ads on the screens, right? You could even play a computer game on the screens, actually.
When did this go in? Because I was at Gasoline Grill over the summer, maybe July. Is this very recent?
Yeah, it's very recent. I think it's been there for a month. So it's a fairly new setup.
All right.
And the reason why it makes sense for us is that our focus is typically on urban environments. There's typically not that much grid available. It often takes a very long time to get more. So these chargers actually allows for us to deploy much faster with a limited amount of money spent on grid. And we can also use it to test new locations, right? So if we have a location where we're not quite sure if it's going to work or not, we can deploy this kind of charger. We can test it out for a year and a half or whatever period we want to. And then if it doesn't work, we can actually move it. And we have not sort of allocated too much CapEx into grid. So it gives a lot of opportunity for us to stay flexible and to actually also make that sort of additional revenue that only strengthens the business case. So even though this charger is much more expensive than a regular ultra-fast charger, in any shape or form, it sort of does that extra revenue and it gives us a lot of other opportunities.
Yeah, I would assume so as well. I love that kind of experimental approach with it. How's it going so far? Is it delivering what you expected from it? Is it kind of as... I know there's more complexities with setting it up, but I guess it's also a learning process for you and getting the battery there, connecting it correctly to the charge point, building the right flow so that you can have the electrons going back and forth.
Yeah, so from a performance perspective, it's doing really well. We had a notion that the battery would be depleted much faster, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. So from a performance perspective, it works really well. We've had some technical issues with some SIM cards, which has been playing up, but seems to be fixed now. But as you said, there's a bit of a trial and error here, and that has always been our DNA, that we try out a lot of different things to find those sort of areas where we can make a difference or do things slightly different to actually make a stronger business case or a more flexible setup or whatever it is, right? So
yeah, definitely. Because I can imagine if you have 4 UFCs next to each other and 4 taxis charging at exactly the same time, you need that extra kick to be able to give a fair balance of kilowatts to each of the individual cars on that site, right? Because the load might not be able to cater for it. So Matt, we've talked obviously about Stella Energy, the new business model, spinning it off, your launch in Oslo, which is super exciting, can already see the sites on your website. But what made you choose Stella Energy as the brand name? What does that actually mean to you and to the Viggo Group?
We actually did quite a lot of work trying to find that new name, and we were very close to settling on a name, but it just didn't feel right. And then literally in the, in the last minutes of deciding, we started to look into more sort of sources for inspiration, and we came across a very old poem, actually, which kind of explains this change there was back in the day when the electricity sort of came around, right? And describes this sort of goddess of electricity, and her name is Stella. And we just kind of like the name. As you already mentioned, the other side of the business is called Viggo, and that's a boy's name or a man's name, and we wanted to have something that sort of resonated with the other side of the equation, right? So if the automobile or the car or the vehicle is a very sort of masculine world, is masculine kind of thing, we wanted the electricity to have sort of that opposite, right? Because naturally without the man, there is no woman, or without the woman, there's no man. So we kind of wanted it to be a very sort of female name, but then at the same time sort of projecting that sort of professionalism. And you can also sort of, I hope you can see that in sort of the branding and the way we sort of present ourselves. And I think it gives a really good balance to sort of those two aspects of EVs, really.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I was not expecting that. Thank you.
That's a good story. And when will they now be taking on their new wrap in Copenhagen with the new white and orange coloring?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are working on this as we speak. I hope very soon we'll be able to sort of present the new design. As it turns out, the hypercharger from Alpitronic is a bit of a, it's not the easiest thing to do a full foliage on. So we are working on, finding that sort of right balance between the design and then also what is actually possible. It has to still look decent, right?
Yeah, I guess, you have post and then you also have those that are still on the manufacturing line to try to
exactly right. Yeah, so the new ones, naturally, they will be fully skinned when they come off the manufacturing line, but the old ones there have to have a decent look as well. That is within the brand guidelines, so to speak.
Mess, we always pose one question to our guests at the end of every episode. So wanted to ask you the same question. If you could bust one myth about electric vehicles or electric vehicle charging, what would that myth be?
That's a good question. What we often hear for some of the riders who's driving in the taxis is that they get car sick, right? They get car sick in an electric car. There seems to be sort of a myth that if you sit in the back of an electric car, you get more car sick. And I guess there's some truth to this myth, but then again, it very much comes down to the person who's actually driving the car, right? So our drivers spend a lot of time in the driving academy, if there's such thing, where they actually learn how to drive an electric vehicle, because a lot of the electric vehicles that's on the market today, they have a bit of a hard sort of a stop when you take your foot off the gas, right? It becomes like, woo, right? And if you're sitting in the back there and you're fiddling with your phone, you can actually get car sick, right? But if you know how to drive an electric car, or you even put it into this special mode that most of the newer EVs has, then you sort of don't get that car sickness in the same way, actually. So it's a mix of good advice. If you want to, either drive it or being driven by an EV, to ask the person driving it to actually drive it properly and not do the whole speeding out of a turn is also a great way to get car sick in an electric car. So our drivers is also taught not to do that. So, yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's also a new one. And it makes sense because it's single pedal driving, right?
That is a new one. And next time I get into Viggo, I'll be like, hey, can you drive better? Can you slow down and drive better and see how that goes? Show me your license. Show me your academy certificate. I want to make sure that you achieve that.
Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah. That's great. I really enjoyed this conversation, Mess. This has been fantastic. So we want to thank you for your time. I think this kind of makes me think of Monta a little bit. Obviously, I'm sitting looking at the Monta logo, but as I'm over here in the United States and we're trying to kind of bring a lot of what we learned in the Scandinavian market, and we have that kind of unique privilege to come from a very far ahead electric vehicle market, frankly, in Scandinavia. And I think similarly, kind of Viggo and now Stella and Viggo could not be born in Rome, right? Or in Barcelona or in Madrid. Copenhagen is one of the biggest electric taxi fleets, right? So it's really kind of a business that could only be born in Copenhagen or in Scandinavia. And if you can nail this model in Scandinavia, like eventually the Parises and the Romes and the Madrids and the Barcelonas will get there. And hopefully when they do get there, you have a model that you can export easily and say, look, we already solved this. We already got this in place in these cities. And we solved that problem 2-3 years ago. And I think it's really a cool project.
Yeah, thank you so much. To be honest, eventually we'll come to the southern part of Europe and the rest of the world, because the truth is that the unit economics of running a taxi is actually much better when you run it on electricity. You just save much more money on the fuel side of things, right? And that alone is enough to drive the change. So if somebody builds out the infrastructure and taxi drivers, they get this understanding, they can actually save a lot of money every week on driving EVs instead, then, the change will come. It's inevitable, in my opinion.
Completely agree. Mads, thanks so much. Really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.